The anti-gun argument is the anti-immigration argument, precisely. They're completely the same. And then both people go, no! The moment you say that.
What are some misconceptions that people often make when they're describing firearms?
The official answer was that there's no possible way we can attribute anything to the assault weapons ban.
Do you believe that the world is a better place with firearms?
If there was a button, right, and you could press the button and the gun never happened, would you press it? And I said, hell no. I think of what was before the gun, like how did people fight before the gun? And that's horrible. Let's think about guns and automobiles. That's like the largest source of death, but we tolerate it. We do little things, seatbelt, to deal with some of these externalities, but we never say, get rid of the automobile. Buy a semi-automatic 22. Just get something cheap. Go out to the range and start shooting at stuff. Just shoot at some cans and see if you like it. Treat it like a hobby, but it's a hobby that relates to something much more important.
Hello, and welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan, and I am the host of this series. Governments all over the world have long sought to restrict and regulate man's access to guns. Perhaps for this very reason, firearms have emerged as one of the most prominent and pressing matters facing the libertarian community today. My guest for today, Matthew Larosiere, is a lawyer, policy director, as well as the host of the Fudd Busters podcast. He has spent many years thoroughly studying firearms and the misinformation that is propagated by statist gun control advocates. This is episode 22 of Morgan Meets the Eye, in which Matt and I discuss gun rights, the technical mechanics of firearms, and the fallacious reasoning behind various pieces of gun control legislation, among other topics. Hello, Matt. Thanks for coming on to the show. And first off, where should my listeners go to check out more of your work?
We've got Fudd Busters, my YouTube channel. I'm on Twitter at Fudd Busters. I'm kind of all over the place, but you should be able to get to all of our different stuff through there. And of course, if you're interested in, DIY gunsmithing and stuff like that, I run maf-arms.com, which you can get a lot of different parts and things to help you out with that. Like we have a lot of fun head spacing and bolt gapping kits to like take all of the hard work out of it so that the end user can just enjoy the fun parts of the build. And we've got a couple new designs coming out really soon that I'm kind of excited for.
Excellent, and looking forward to seeing it. I guess before we dive into anything else, though, I do want to preface this discussion by pointing out that, although I'm somebody who would consider himself a staunch libertarian, somebody who's deeply opposed to the government, I'm not really the kind of libertarian that you would see as a regular at, the gun range or a participant in any gun club or anything like that. I've never really been an expert in firearms, even though, due to their very nature and due to the way that the government has sought to regulate them, they are a huge part of libertarian culture. So, yes, I've been a bit embarrassed in the past at my lack of familiarity and my lack of experience with guns. In fact, actually, the genesis of this subject matter, for one word, goes back to about a year ago when I was actually doing a live stream with a colleague of mine. And he and some others who were present were talking about their guns, the firearms they had, the ones they'd seen, the guns that they wanted to purchase, and so on and so forth. So anyway, just to kind of give you some background there, I did jump into this discussion by actually talking about a long gun that my family had many years ago. And we had taken it out shooting. I fired it off plenty of times. And it was a fun experience. It was a great time. That's all true. The problem is that I was so uninformed about guns at that time that I ended up making some incorrect claims about this particular gun. For example, I said that if you held the trigger down, the gun would fire multiple rounds until you just let go. And that's not true. I want to state for the record, I've never owned a fully automatic gun or anything like that. I was just completely mistaken on that issue. Anyway, though, this did lead to a series of follow-up questions about certain things such as, the year of the gun's manufacturing, the specific type of gun that it was. And the problem here is that these were questions that I was simply not equipped to answer. But I have since then, I have even prior to that point, I have long been acutely aware that that if I'm going to call myself a libertarian, if I'm going to call myself somebody who's a staunch defender of individual rights, I'm going to need to be knowledgeable about guns, as well as the laws and the culture that surrounds them. So anyway, after this experience, I felt I had some kind of need to atone for this situation, and I figured that making an episode devoted to guns could be a good way to do that.
Well, no, that's really cool and really refreshing. And so, I don't know if everybody knows this, but I'm kind of a career libertarian. I started my career at the Cato Institute. I am a graduate of the Charles Koch associate program and the fellows program and all that stuff. But when I was doing the career policy stuff in DC, I did notice that, well, and also I escaped DC because I couldn't handle those fuckers. It's, even in libertarian circles, you deal with a lot of coastal elitist types who will pay lip service to like gun rights, but they don't know the first thing about firearms, and also because they don't have like the life experience to be able to really understand what guns are for. And I don't mean like, oh, they've never been on a farm, they've never been hunting. I mean, no. Most of these people are like somewhat privileged and they've never felt in fear for their life. And so they can't really relate to the fact that, no, the need to own a gun is really acute for most people. And because most people have, I mean, thank God it's not a huge chance, but it's substantially more than zero chance of being violently victimized in an incredibly threatening and dangerous way. And so I feel like this is something libertarianism especially is lacking, in that, there's a lot of guys who write really great articles and, I'm friends with them about the history of the right to keep and bear arms and stuff like that, but they don't, like, they haven't been able to put their hands in it. Like, they don't carry a gun. They don't understand as acutely why it's so important. And I guess I'm saying it's refreshing to hear you say that it's refreshing to hear that you're aware of what you're not aware of, right? And like express the desire to engage with that. But I think one of the things where as soon as you start engaging with it, and as soon as you start seeing that, especially if you are into voluntarism, if you're a voluntarist and you don't have a firearm, like, there's serious problems with the way you, right? Like, it's either that you have substantially low value of your own life, which is certainly possible, right? Some people make that decision for themselves, or you haven't like fully thought about what it means to, what your ideology means. And so I guess to preempt the question, it's that the answer is the Draco. Everybody needs to have a Draco, a Romanian MD90 carbine, with a folding stock and a dong grip. That's the minimum viable gun that everyone needs to have, and that should settle that.
I'm glad that you touched on that particular subject matter there as well. I will just mention that I have spent, the past year or so studying guns a bit more closely. Although I would still say, even at this point, I'm still far from perfect. I have nowhere near the experience that you have on this. So with that said, I am a bit curious, though. How did you get into guns exactly, Matt? What has your experience been with them?
So it's kind of interesting. I was raised by a single mom, so like I didn't have guns around as a kid, really. But I do remember, my mom was like, at a certain point, she's like, you need to know how to use a gun as a man. And so she had this guy who he was a DHS agent, right? And so I would have taken it with more grain of salt, but he taught me to shoot. And that was the first athletic activity, right? Quasi-athletic, aside from soccer. I was good at soccer, but I got immediately super positive feedback on. And it was just such a enjoyable experience, and just very, very logical, very step by step. And by following the steps, I got a good result, and I could see my results on the target, and And the guy was like, "You're an act," like, he's like, "I'm serious. You're really good at this." And that kind of was intoxicating. And so I immediately begged my mom to buy me a BB gun, and I went in the backyard and I would shoot the BB gun and just keep trying to get the target smaller. And then when I was 18, which now, God, you have to wait till you're 21 to go buy a gun. But when I was 18, I went to Palm Beach Shooting Center, which is a hellhole. Don't go there. But, and this will age me to anyone who's a younger person buying guns now. But I bought on lunch break when I was going to the Palm Beach Community College, I went to Palm Beach Shooting Center and bought an M1 carbine for $300. And then like that was it, right? Funny enough, I when I started my career as a legal scholar, whatever you'd want to call me, right? I was doing tax law stuff, and I just always liked guns, but I always thought Second Amendment stuff, well, that's sexy, right? That's for Harvard grads and things. But then when I was at Cato and I was doing the tax law stuff, a gun case came up, and the other lawyers were like holding the pleadings like they were like dirty. Like, does anyone want to do this gun case? And I was like, yeah, I do. And they're like, okay, gun guy. And so from then on, I showed an acute interest in it, and I did a good job. So I wrote dozens and dozens of amicus briefs while I was there. I started doing popular press, started doing TV and stuff all on the gun area. And it was because there's a huge vacuum for, there wasn't a vacuum for vaguely pro-gun opinions, but there was a huge vacuum for pro-gun, morally consistent, ideologically consistent, and thoroughly explained pieces. And so that's, that was my whole start of my career, and it just all went from there.
I'm glad that you mentioned the importance of moral consistency and just consistency in general, because I do feel like that is something that is lacking overall, really on both sides of the gun debate among the people who get involved in it. And
the funniest thing, and people hate me for this, because I've pointed out, if you look at, if you reduce it to formal logic, the anti-gun argument is the anti-immigration argument. Precisely. They're completely the same. And then both people, right, go, no! You say that. Like, but I'm like, hey, you can consistently say, I hate immigrants, right? You can say I hate immigrants, but this process is broken, right?
Right.
And it's broken for the same reasons a gun permitting regime would be broken. But then people are like, oh, you just want to arm the illegals and this and that. To which I'm like, yes, but not for free.
Oh, yes. And I definitely plan to touch on the whole issue of, gun rights in relation to illegal immigration as well. Before focusing on more of the opposition to gun rights and how the government itself fits into this particular conflict, I think it makes sense to start from the matter of the firearms themselves. So then, in that case, what are guns exactly? How would you define what a firearm is to somebody?
This is a fun one. So, like, a firearm is an instrument for projecting force over a distance. That's what makes a gun a gun. And then I guess I kind of sensing where you're going with that. There's certain steps that substantially increase the efficacy of a firearm. And then you'll see there's a lot of differences in firearms that are distinctions without a real difference. So if you take all of the accessories off, the way it looks or whatever, you really have single shot firearms, repeating firearms, which are manually operated firearms, and then self-loading firearms. And those are like the three categories. Like a repeating firearm, which is like a bolt action rifle or a pump action rifle, or even like a manually operated pistol or a revolver. That's a huge step up from a single shot firearm, right? Because you can project not a continuous amount of force, but you can project force more than once over a distance. And then after that, a self-loading firearm, which is a semi-automatic or a fully automatic firearm, so everything from a Glock to an M60, that's a huge step up from a repeating firearm because you can continuously project force. there's obviously a justification for having the highest level because other people have the highest level, right? Because if we're going to equalize, we have to equalize. That said, I don't think there's a principled distinction between an automatic weapon, like a fully automatic weapon, and a semi-automatic weapon. If we were to put it in a computer program and separate and strip it to its bare essentials, I think it winds up being the same thing.
Now, one thing I have found is that, guns are certainly exceptional and almost unique insofar as their definition hinges not only on what they are, but also on what they are not. I think there's a great deal of misinformation that's being spread about guns, and I think that, quite frankly, a lot of it is intentional. In any case, though, what are some misconceptions that you think people often make when they're describing firearms or any potential threats they pose to society?
So there's two broad categories, right? And they fall on the side of anti-gun people and pro-gun people. So the reason I refer to a firearm as an instrument for projecting force is because I want to be morally honest and internally consistent. Because people who are like, oh, it's for poking holes, right? They're those are the people who are trying to it's okay, well, why do you need to poke a hole, right? That's a very specific thing, right? It makes sense when you're applying it to target shooting, but then that doesn't make sense when you're applying it to self-defense. So what's the deal? No, it's it's for projecting force, right? Just like all weapons really are instruments of force projection that then have other ancillary uses. So the anti-gun side makes a substantial misconception by referring to guns as a public health crisis, as some kind of societal problem that needs to be solved. And the thing that they're doing when they put guns in when they look at guns through the lens of public health, is they're treating the gun as if it's like a pathogen, right? This is something that only causes harm because it's a weapon. And so its effects need to then be controlled. They're ignoring any utility. What they're doing when they view the gun as a public health problem, they are saying this has no utility, and that's insanely unsupportable. If guns had no utility, people would not spend money to buy them. You can argue that it's irrational. You can argue that that they spend too much money, right? And that's fine. And in fact, that's probably true. I collect bad guns. And sometimes a bad gun is rare and I have to spend a lot of money on it. And it's not a purchase that can be explained for its utility. But at the core of it, there is objectively utility. And then I'd say on the pro-gun side, a massive dishonesty that happens is the sporting discussion. Because what the fuck is sporting?
Right.
That is an intensely disingenuous sleight of hand, where they're like, no, this is a modern sporting rifle or whatever. Because then you're like, well, what is sports? Are you going by the federal government's definition? In which case, the AR-15 and the AKM are not considered sporting rifles. So which sports are we talking about? Hunting? If you're talking about hunting, it means that 2-round magazine capacity limitations are presumptively acceptable. It means you're saying that you can't fire it unless you've paid $300 to the crown, right? What is it you're going at here? So the thing that pro-gun people are disingenuous about is the fact that these things are for their greatest utility is for killing people, and we do sports and we do practice. And the practices all revolves around killing people. And that's true for many sports. We just are more okay with pretending that tackle football isn't based in some way on very old battle strategies, right? We're okay with just covering that up. But when it comes to a gun, I guess we're a lot closer to the actual end use case. And so that makes people uncomfortable. And so instead of dealing with the uncomfortable reality that, yes, I need this because one day something bad might happen and I might have to kill someone, is too hard to say.
there is certainly a tendency to abuse semantics in this whole dialogue here. Like you're saying, with as far as sporting purposes. Another common one that I see a lot is when people talk about putting through common sense gun laws. And I feel like that makes a kind of assumption on what constitutes common sense gun laws. Are they really common sense to begin with?
Well, if I may, the greatest comparison is actually one that they go to present, by they being the anti-gun side, which is the automobile. And they're always like, "Oh, if only you would," right? Is because they make a disingenuous comparison, saying, "Right, why don't we treat guns like the automobile, where you have to have a license?" Or it's like, oh, actually, do you have to have? They're not engaging with that as granularly as maybe they should. But let's think about guns and automobiles. That's like the largest source of death, right? That the ordinary person deals with every day. It's intensely dangerous, right? You're putting a bag of blood in a steel box that's traveling, incredibly fast. It's a total death trap, but we tolerate it. Why? Because we understand how useful it is to be able to move our bodies over distances so much more rapidly. So we we do little things, seat belts and things like that to deal with some of these externalities, but we never say get rid of the automobile, right? Unless you're like the most insane, like tanky, or, like farm culture weirdo with the tubes and things. But like no one seriously talks about getting rid of the automobile, despite the fact that there's an unbelievable, like an exponential greater degree of danger to the average person. But they talk about the gun, and their immediate answer is prohibition, because they cannot grapple with the fact that it serves a utility.
I'm very glad that you brought up the automobile in this case. What you're saying actually mirrors a lot of what the economist Thomas Sowell has spoken about in the past.
I love Sowell.
Right, exactly. As far as, airplanes and fatalities such as that, and the importance of seatbelts and all this, and maybe he was saying, perhaps we could avoid these deaths and fatalities by just completely stopping all air travel, for example. But in reality, this poses much greater, detractions from society as far as transporting certain goods, certain foods. It lowers
Right.
our own standard of living considerably. And going back to the issue of cars, I've often thought of cars and guns as almost similar in a sense. They are both considered, in a way, symbols of attached to masculinity and things such as that. They both have many different brands, for example, brands that do have, important differences. With cars, we have the Buick, the Ford, Mitsubishi, Honda, all of that. And with guns as well, and this is kind of where I'm leading with that, there are different brands. We have the Smith & Wesson, we have Walther, different things such as that. And what
Walther's my favorite handgun.
Yes, and that actually leads me exactly to what I wanted to ask is, so what would you say in technical terms are the differences between these particular brands?
Oh God, you're in danger of getting an incredibly nerdy answer that will mean probably nothing to your audience. So if you're okay with that, I can explain this.
Oh, please do.
But so first of all, it has to be like, we have to talk about categorically. Are you talking about handguns, so in terms of self-loading handguns, semi-automatic handguns, almost all of them use the Browning lockwork, as it was modified to not require a swinging link, like starting arguably with the high power, but the high power has a weird thing. But so like the Glock has the same lockwork as a Smith & Wesson SD, as the same, well, not the right, but like mechanically speaking, the same as a Walther, as the HKVP9, as most guns. There's some very slight differences, like Beretta, who has a Browning lockwork semi-automatic pistol, also has one that's based on a World War II German falling block. So like the most important distinction is I'd say in a semi-automatic pistol, when it's from a lock breech, which if it fires a real caliber, it's lock breech, is going to be what the locking mechanism is and the trade-offs there. But since most of them use the same one, it comes down to material quality and really the workmanship. And guns are more art than science, is what I've learned, because I do a little bit of gun design, and I am in, I manufacture firearms parts as well. Almost everyone is using the same steels for the most part, right? They're getting them from different places, but like the material science has gotten pretty good. What it boils down to is how much variance are we going to accept as a company? And so like you'll see a Taurus come out. I'm talking about their semi-automatics, right? Their revolvers are actually pretty good because revolvers wind up, pretty much every revolver has to be hand fit. But in terms of semi-automatics, you'll see the Taurus and the Smith & Wessons and stuff kind of like, you'll be able to substantially see a difference in the fit between one and another. And then also how much time they spend doing surfacing and ergonomic analysis before they commit to a design. And so like in terms of ergonomics, like you have horrifying, the bottom of the barrel, like Springfield dog shit that is not designed for a human hand, and like fight me if you disagree. And then I think and then there's companies who are like, oh, the end all be all was the 1911, so they base everything around the 1911 grip angle. And then you've got me, who's a weirdo, who's like, oh, it's actually a blend of the 1911 and these other designs and these other, like, and so the Walthers actually have the best grip angle, but then so it's all corks. So all that to say, it's all bullshit. So like I can sit here and nerdily argue why the Walther P99 is the greatest service weapon ever designed, but it's greater by like 1% than the Glock, which is greater by like 1/4% than the Smith & Wesson, which, right? So it's very rare that a company produces a bad gun. I'm talking like in the $400 or above range. Thank God it's gotten to the point where they're pretty much all good. So we're talking about my buddy Trevor Burrus. When we were at Cato together, he would ask me to explain the difference between different guns, and I'd sit there for like 45 minutes explaining, and he's like, so this is like when wine people take 2 corks and sniff them and then argue, right? It's like that they're still grapes, they've done about the same, the alcohol content's about the same, but you swear that this one's better. And I'm like, yeah, it's true. But that's handguns. In terms of rifles, there's a big, much wider berth in the operating mechanisms that are in the rifles that are going around today. We've got AR-15 pattern, AR-18 pattern, and AKM pattern is mostly the different stuff we see. And then there's like some real trade-offs and differences. The AR-15, very accurate, very, very reliably, frankly, sealed system that it has some disadvantages when you try to take it outside of its original design footprint. The AKM, intense reliability, that has intense reliability, intense power, incredible disadvantages when you try to take it outside of its footprint, and when you try to do things like mount optics to them, right? Things that ARs like, AKs hate. AR-18 blends them, and the blending is a series of compromises one way or the other in each and every individual design. So like, but it all does come down to the same thing, right? Where most of these are going to be good, but there's only one objective best gun, and it's the Draco.
Your reference to the AR-18, just out of sheer curiosity, to help me to understand and put these pieces together in a bit more of an organized manner, what is the difference between an AR-15 and an AR-18 exactly?
So this is an AR-10 bolt carrier group, which is the heart of the entire system. It's this being DPMS pattern, it's AR-15 but larger, right? So it's just a big AR-15 bolt carrier group. It has to be linear in this fashion. So this bolt has to travel at least the length of the cartridge. And so that means you have to have a spring and a buffer behind this. So you're going to have a fairly long system. The way it works is also interesting in that there's an internal piston, right? Gas gets dumped in here, which propels the carrier rearward relative to the bolt, unlocks it, gets it going backwards. Really a great system if you are going to have a gun with the magazine forward and a stock back here, right? Because by design, the AR-15 has the weapons recoil completely linear with the barrel, which is then going to be linear with the shooter's shoulder, because this is designed to go into the center of the stock. It's a very good design. The AR-18, we've gotten a lot more compact. It's the same general bolt layout, but we have a little square guy that can have a recoil spring here, so the whole action can fit into the footprint of its travel. So now we can have a folding stock, or we can have a bullpup. We can configure this gun in many different ways, compared to the AR-15, without sacrificing reliability, or without, like AR-15s with the folding buffer tube. You can't fire them when they're folded. You don't have to deal with that on the AR-18. The original AR-18 was short stroke piston, where the gas doesn't enter the bolt carrier at all. But this one is actually the AR-15's internal piston mechanism. And then we've got even more AR-18 designs that use the AK's integral long piston, long stroke piston. So the AR-18 has the bolt of an AR-15, right? See, it's the same thing, but it can fit into whatever package you want. The AR-15 and AR-10 have to go in a tube. Have to, period. End of story. So that's the big distinction there. And it's a lot easier to design something for the 18 because it can just sit in any square. Like, you can make it sit in square, you can round the top of it, you can have it sit in a U channel. It's just a lot more adaptable to a completely different footprint of firearm. So like the bullpups, it's a terrible gun, but the British SA-80, the prototype was literally an Armalite AR-18 that they were like, what if we put it back here? And they actually, like, I'm not saying they made a new one. It was just like they took an AR-18 and then just like took the stock off and put a butt pad on it, and they were like, cool, and clapped their hands, and then they completely fucked up copying it. That's how the AR-18 fits. Like the G36 is an AR-18. The AUG, to a lesser extent, is an AR-18. Like the FNC is almost an AR-18, right? There's actually a meme that it's like every military weapon after the AR-15, and it's a Captain Crunch box that says "Oops, all AR-18." So, but yeah.
I really do see that in terms of engineering. People will recognize the engineering genius, the real attention to detail that appears maybe in automobiles or in architecture and maybe factory machinery. But whenever it comes to guns, there seems to be a kind of social taboo that prevents people from recognizing how the ingenious level of attention to detail and how all the pieces fit together and how they work exactly. And in laying that out, you've actually answered a lot of other questions I had been meaning to ask as well, even some that I kind of just had to myself. For example, I've noticed that, there are a lot of terms referring to certain aspects or parts of the guns that the layman may have heard of, but he might have trouble identifying or defining or explaining their significance insofar as the overall gun. For example, we have the clip, the magazine, the receiver contains individual pieces of the firearm, such as the bolt and the breech, and even those terms, and you spoke on those as well, and even those might be misunderstood. Those might not be understood. They might be misunderstood by some people. But basically,
is that firearms are really simple machines, and when you get down to it, they all operate very similarly. Well, most of them. There's some I collect French guns, and there's some fucked up French guns that where the Shoshaw is very clear that I forget his first name, but it's very clear that Shoshaw saw a Remington Model 8, was completely obsessed with it, and then only looked at steam engines for the rest of his life. And then he made the Shoshaw, right? So and then you wind up with this just nightmare box. Right. There's half Model 8, half steam engine.
Oh, so you're saying the steam engine has in that particular case directly influenced the engineering behind the firearm?
Oh, 100%. So the gas assist of the Shoshaw is straight up Shoshaw was staring at a steam engine.
Okay.
He was staring at a steam engine while working in a bicycle shop, and he was like, I can use this. And that's where the Shoshaw came from. Oh, and he was obsessed with it being long recoil like a Model 8. And there were challenges with getting it to work with the French cartridge and stuff. And they're like, oh, well, we need a little more boost. And so he's like, so they use the way steam engines capture gas to accelerate the recoiling mechanism.
Well, I certainly admire the experimental nature of that endeavor. But having laid all of this out, the technical matters of guns and how they function and, how they work and what they are, having laid that out, it makes sense to address from here really the opposition to guns, perhaps on the philosophical or the psychological level, whether we're talking about everyday social discomfort around them, or I would say the more serious matter of governmental gun control. And speaking of gun control, my question would then be, what is gun control exactly? How do we define it? What kinds of barriers does it tend to impose on gun ownership? And of course, these barriers in reality, in practice, they do tend to be different from what they were actually intended to be by the people putting them forth.
So, how do you define gun control? There's many. The way I would define it is any precondition on the peaceable possession or use of a firearm. I don't consider laws saying, sentence enhancements for, using a Mac 11 while robbing a bank or whatever. I don't consider that to be gun control. Right. It might be technically, but because it would have a chilling effect on the use of Mac 11s in bank robberies. But no, I would define gun control as anything related to, in advance of the peaceable possession or use of a firearm.
Having laid out what you do and don't consider to be gun control, having pointed out the types of legislation that politicians might pass in response to firearms, whether they pass these laws in response to public demand or for more sinister, self-serving reasons, I'm curious as to how you've seen people react to guns in your own personal experience. I know this is obviously a very broad question, but I'm curious to the range of reactions you've observed across the whole population, in terms of people being more supportive, people tending to be more concerned for the most part.
So I guess I don't know if I understand the question. What do you mean, people's reactions to guns?
Well, basically their views towards it. Have you generally seen people accepting of guns, people who are welcoming of that type of culture, or more resistant to it, or more squeamish around them?
Well, certainly before COVID, there's much more of a visceral, why would you want to have that around you type of thing. And I used to deal with that a lot. There was, in my law school, there was an Australian exchange program, and I was always the one that was tasked with taking them shooting. And there would always be a couple of them that was like, I can't comprehend it, right? And so I talked to them and be like, okay, well, think about this. What if something bad happens, right? And that's always the hard thing. Once you crack that perception, it becomes a lot easier to have a frank and honest conversation. But before COVID, there was a lot of, I cannot comprehend why you would ever perceive that need. After COVID, that's gone. And then it becomes a question of degrees. Which, people have, people who didn't grow up around guns or don't know much about guns are still incredibly suspicious when they see what you might call a military style firearm. That type of thing. Right.
And yes, and like you're saying, there does definitely appear to be some segment of the population who's a bit squeamish around the subject of guns. And unfortunately, they tend to be people who have the loudest and also most pivotal voices in regards to policy. So I'm kind of curious, what is it about guns that causes this discomfort in people? For example, I know that there are certain people in our society, there are so many that it's inevitable, really. Certain people will see us having this conversation, for example, and they'll react negatively to it. I know some people may see this and say, how can you people talk about something as dangerous about guns? You're trying to prevent gun control. You want no restrictions on it. You're putting people's lives in danger. They might even say, I've lost a loved one to gun violence. How would you feel if you lost a loved one to gun violence? That, which in reality, I think is something of a non sequitur fallacy to begin with. That, because you've lost someone to gun violence, suddenly the government has to get involved and place these, sweeping measures.
Well, and also that they haven't done the analysis, or if they have, I would disagree with how they've done the analysis of whether confiscatory prohibition would have helped.
Right. Yeah.
But for the present state of gun control, would you have lost your gun? Would you have lost your relative? Right. It's very rarely the case that it would have prevented it. And not to say that there aren't edge cases, and there certainly are, and that's what law is capable of doing. Laws are capable of pushing things around at the margin. But people don't. That's nuance, and nuance in the present day is disgusting and boring. No one wants to deal with that.
Yes, and one point that I would make personally about the deeper problem behind this anti-gun mindset is that this deeply averse, fearful mentality towards firearms is actually counterproductive towards gun safety. I mean, gun safety, I would say, is immensely important, and I can't emphasize that enough. But this tendency to ignore firearms altogether, to push aside the fact of their existence, and in doing so, completely neglect to learn out how they work and how they should be handled, just leaves them ignorant and defenseless in the end. And so my question then would be, how can the case be made that taking guns away from law-abiding citizens, people who are not imprisoned or on parole, is an infringement on their personal liberties?
Well, I always resist the term law-abiding, because you should certainly resist. You should not abide unjust laws. But I always frame it on take it back to what it is, right? Like, what does affecting the peaceable possession of something do? Right. So I prefer to put it back out on that person, and I think it's very hard to defend gun control in that context.
People tend to conflate the mere ownership of a gun to gun violence or gun homicide, when these two things are by no means the same thing. Right. And to treat them as the same thing is, naturally putting the false appearance of security over the reality of one's own, personal freedoms. And so one question I'm kind of curious about is, why is it that when people have this anxiety around guns, what is it that causes them to turn to the government of all places simply because they don't like the idea of people having easy access to guns? Because when you think about it, what does the state out of all institutions have to do with this matter? I mean, you would think this is kind of ironic, considering that the police agencies of, the local, the federal, the state governments, just within the United States, for example, already own over 1 million firearms in their possession. So,
well, it's just as idiotic as the people on the pro-gun side thinking that,
right,
when the confiscatory laws come into play, that their local law enforcement isn't going to do it. Right. It's because the state is a god to those people who don't know what God is, and so they wind up praying to it and asking for their God to deliver them from their perceived threats. I mean, and that's, of course, that's severely talking down to these people. But I mean, at a certain point, I think going to the state to ask for confiscatory prohibition is just undeserving of a serious response, because it's just so absurdly indefensible that I've like, so it's the availability and their perception of, and everything they've been taught, right? Who solves problems? What is it, like, who got rid of the dangerous drugs? Who stopped the snake oil salesman? It was the state.
Right. The post hoc fallacy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all, and just like, oh, industrialization was so bad, and it's all better now because the state did something in the 30s, decades after conditions improved. So,
Yes,
it's the same thing.
Right. We could just as easily argue that things are improving despite the government as to because of it. They've shown no real link between, the government and the actual effects that are occurring.
You can make the disingenuous argument that society has progressed because firearms have progressed, right? It's all gone at the same rate. So, they've been making more guns continuously and things have gotten better. So it must be the guns.
Yes.
So it's common knowledge. That's why they go to the state, because it's common knowledge that we have top down power, and so you go to the top.
Right. And yes, and going back to what you were saying earlier about the pro-gun side in relation to the police, I do think it's also worth mentioning that, the police themselves are, of course, exempt from the requirements, in obtaining a gun when they're on duty in most cases. And some people might say that, that's not that big of a deal in a country like the US, where, comparatively speaking, our gun control laws are actually fairly lax compared to other countries. But the thing is, in those other countries, we can turn that on its head and say, we have these places where private citizens have to go through very extensive, very strenuous, methods to get a hold of an actual firearm, whereas the police can get one just by virtue of being a servant of the state.
Right. Or even just saying that they are one.
Exactly.
Like, there's plenty of fake cops out there. Happens all the time. So, like, whenever you point to the emperor's clothes, people are always like, stop. But it's just a mess. And we don't even have, in every way, the most liberal gun laws in the world. But that doesn't matter, right? And we don't have the highest incidences of gun violence, but ignore that, because those aren't they're not like America, right? And you start asking them, well, why aren't you including those countries? And they won't tell you that it's because we only want to include white countries. And it's like, well, is this a white country? You're happy to, like, what's going on? It's they want to point to, there's comparison is the theft of joy in all ways, and it's never, because there's never an honest comparison. We're living in a country that's like the size of the entire EU, and has every different culture that you can possibly imagine living in close proximity to each other. Would you believe that we don't all get along, right? And it's not any one race or culture's fault. It's the fact that people don't like people who are outside of their in-groups. And so that there's it's just the natural result, right? Look at the borders of any country in the rest of the world where, you have intense nationalism. They're like in Pakistan and China, they like no one ever thinks about how much they hate each other, but they have skirmishes constantly. It's like that everywhere. People, the Finns hate the Swedes. They don't like each other. It's just whatever. And if they were living together, they'd probably hurt each other, right? It just is what it is.
I do think it would be, beneficial at this time to kind of move beyond the theory and the philosophy behind gun control that we've been speaking on, and to discuss, its actual specific implementation and the effects thereof. So one particularly relevant and timely issue related to gun control, at least as of today, is the discourse surrounding the bump stock ban. So the Supreme Court, recently struck down a ban on bump stocks. And for context, the Trump administration passed a rule following the Las Vegas shooting in 2017, claiming that any rifles that were equipped with bump stocks could be classified as machine guns, which the Supreme Court recently rejected and reversed. So for those who don't know, a bump stock causes the trigger of a gun to be propelled back and forth by the recoil. And in doing this, semi-automatic weapons can function fairly similarly to fully automatic ones.
Well, so like it's something that's hard to talk about because like the crux of the decision is that well, no, they don't. So like there's a federal definition of machine gun, and it's shoots automatically, and that's like shoots automatically, more than one shot, single function of the trigger. So it's a fairly detailed definition, and the federal government had repeatedly said these bump stock things. Was actually, I mean, going even further back than that, the bump stock started because there was the Akins accelerator, which was a stock for a 1022 that had a spring. And so it had a little shelf on it. And so if you pulled the trigger and sat on the shelf, the gun would recoil against this spring and then push it back so that as long as you kept your finger on that shelf, set it off again. And it would, you know. And so then Akins was like, okay, well, what do we do? Since you're saying the stock's a machine gun under the law, how do we make it not a machine gun? And they're like, well, you can cut the stock into a couple pieces or you can take the spring out. So they're like, okay. And they take the spring out and the bump stock is born. Because guess what? You can just use your arm as the spring, basically. And so the whole fight in Cargill, which is the bump stock case, and if I got the case name wrong, I'm sorry. I don't memorize case names because I have better things to do. The whole fight is about, is the federal government's reinterpretation a permissible interpretation of statute? It's not a Chevron case because it involves criminal consequences. So courts of appeal were just letting the government do this, right? And they're saying, it looks good enough to me. And then once the Supreme Court like specifically directs, no, engage with the statute. How is this automatic and how is this a single function? Like, you don't get to pick one and then get both. So basically the result of Cargill is bifurcating the analysis of what a machine gun is. It has to shoot automatically, and it has to be truly automatic, right? That means devoid of continual human input aside from, right, what starts the function. So like, you know, as long as you hold the button, if it keeps going, that's automatic. And two, it must be initiated by or caused by a single function, and that is a mechanical function. That is a mechanical definition. So then the government's argument is, well, no, because it's like from the perspective of the shooter, the push is the single function. And then the court's like, okay, well, so how does it then keep going if the push is the single function? Well, but like they're just kind of like, you know, like keep doing it just right. And and so like the core of the decision was it's single function, not single function and then some. And that's like, well, that's good. Because there's a few cases where people have been locked up for having things that are not machine, including two cases that I'm representing the individuals on appeal. Most famously, the Matt Hoover case, where that was a whole nother layer of absurd, right? Because the thing wasn't even cut out; it wasn't even a complete device, and there's no evidence it actually worked. And so here's the question, like, can it be a machine gun if we don't know if it works automatically? So that's the long ways around of what happened in the Cargill case.
The very claim that, you know, adding a bump stock to a rifle turns it into a fully automatic weapon is disingenuous, even on the face of it. It's just not really true to begin with, and trying to pass it off that way is, you know, forgive me for the pun, a long shot. Now, and there's definitely no question that the striking down of the bump stock ban was definitely a clear victory for the liberty movement. But this is not the only form of widespread firearm regulation that the government's trying to put through currently. For example, another one that the Biden administration is pursuing is they're trying to regulate ghost guns, though the Supreme Court's decision isn't actually expected until next year in 2025. Now, what are ghost guns exactly? Because, I mean, as technology advances, it's getting easier and easier to build them, and fairly effective ones at that. You know, ghost guns can almost rival the quality of these corporate and government-made guns. So since they are unserialized and fairly untraceable as a result of being homemade, should they be regulated? And if not, what would you say is the case for ghost guns to remain unregulated?
Well, so like you have to start with the answer to the question, which is what is a ghost gun? And so like if you're going by what the government and the anti-gun side is suggesting, which is a firearm that can't be traced, it means that a ghost gun is any gun that was either made by an individual or is more than 5 years old. Because firearms traces can only take you to the first retail purchaser. And after that, they're completely meaningless. So used guns, old guns, any gun that's changed hands more than one time is untraceable.
Okay.
That's a huge... Oh, and also any gun made before 1968, because guess what? Serial numbers weren't required before 1968.
Yes. Yes, the Gun Control Act of 1968 was definitely, a major turning point.
But guess when most guns were made?
I'm going to say
past. Like not immediately right now, right? So we're dealing with most guns in the world are ghost guns. That's the simple fact. They're not traceable because tracing is bullshit. It's not real. It's all CSI effect nonsense. It can only take you to the first person who bought it at retail. And guess what? Most guns are not there anymore. So that's the biggest band-aid to rip off on ghost guns. If people, the bigger concern that people have is like, about this increasing, DIY firearms, increasing the ability of people in restrictive regimes to be able to gain access to a firearm at all. In which case, yeah, that actually does something, right? Like the full DIY guns, like the FGC-9 and stuff like that. Significant game changers, which had a significant impact, for example, on the conflict in Myanmar. Like FGC-9 was able to be used to ambush government officials, take their equipment, and then take that equipment and do additional ambushes, and this whole thing cascaded, and guess what? They won. Right. And it started with DIY hardware. So that's very real. And that's just human ingenuity, though. Like, people are gonna make what they want to make, and you kind of can't stop them. You can make it illegal, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't illegal in Myanmar to, ambush the government.
So basically, this whole premise that regulating ghost guns or banning them altogether is really just a matter of, misinformation, really.
Based on a false premise. Like the premise is false. The premise is that these are different from every other gun, and in reality, it's exactly as traceable.
Right, exactly. The argument that they can't be traced or they can't be followed, is really just very misleading to begin with. Considering that so many, firearms that already exist, can fit that same criteria.
Right. Yeah, it's the ghost guns are exactly like any gun that is more than 5 years old, right. Which is most guns. Yes. So they're normal guns. There's not really a safety distinction at this point. There's some people out there that put out some real garbage, but right, like the people who are getting together and testing these designs and writing good documentation and stuff like that are putting out incredibly safe stuff that in most of the country is completely legal to produce, and always has been. This isn't a new thing. And one of my favorite things I like to point out is that a lot of guns used in the Revolutionary and Civil War were craft-made firearms. They would import the lock work, which you could get for cheap from Spain, Netherlands, and France. They would get like a bunch of lock work, like just the hammer and trigger mechanism, and then they would put it on craft-made stocks and barrels. That was the 80% of the founding era. It was just buying tons of European locks, trigger mechanisms, and then building craft firearms from them. It's very deeply rooted in our nation's history. It is building guns from, frankly, imported parts, but the feds don't want us to import parts, which is a whole other.
Yes. You could even say that the idea of banning ghost guns is inherently anti-American in a way.
Well, yeah, because that was the first thing they the powder alarm, right?
Right.
Is they weren't they had banned the importation of firearms and parts and ammunition into the country. And what was the first thing that the founders did? Is they surreptitiously imported them, disguising them as something else, right? So, like, and this isn't deep lore. This is like high school history text. So regulating importation is like incredibly un-American. And you know what else is un-American? American-made guns. Because the founders knew that we were not as good at it as the Europeans were. So that's why they loved importing guns.
There are, as far as other issues that are currently, facing people in terms of gun control, another one that may not affect all of the population, but more of just a small segment of it. Some Congress members from the southern states have introduced the Stop Arming Cartels Act of 2024. So, as its name implies, it's meant to prevent Mexican cartels from receiving military-grade weapons. Now, first off, it's going to completely ban civilians from owning 50 caliber rifles. Only the government would be allowed to use these weapons, which is predictable. And people who already legally own these weapons prior to this law being passed have been given 12 months to register, on the National Firearms Registration Record. And victims of gun violence, in response to this, would be able to sue the dealers and manufacturers who violate the Kingpin Act, which is short for the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. And so basically, another result of this is that firearms would no longer be able to be distributed to any individual sanctioned by the Kingpin Act, and the firearms dealers themselves would also now have to start reporting multiple sales of rifles to state and local law enforcement agencies, which they already currently have to do with handguns. So basically, I'm kind of curious what your take on this particular act would be. How you think it fits into the libertarian movement, if you think that this is something should be opposed or amended in some sort of way, or what exactly?
I think that it's a fundamentally unserious proposal. Cartels like 50 cals for several reasons, and if they don't get it from us, they'll get them from somewhere else. Frankly, like the 50 cals and the belt fed parts kits that they're buying are things that like most people don't like because they're too expensive. And so trying to regulate this is actually like, so here's how it currently works. The ATF has talked to like every FFL. And they're like, hey, if somebody in the border state is buying this, like, let us know, because it's probably going to the cartel. And if it's actually going to somebody in Texas or Arizona, they don't even bother them. But what's happening, and I've done I do industry consulting, and I've got a few clients where basically they're like, okay, hey, this is, they're buying this, and ATF will come and talk to them and be like, okay, well, sell it to them, and then give them a direct way to, find who is supplying weapons to the cartel. Why would they want to get rid of that? The cartel is literally snitching on themselves by buying through federal firearms licensees. Consistently, and they are getting people and arresting people who are smuggling these guns into over the border. They're catching those people. So if you actually want to put a stop to it, why would you try to throttle the most obvious and hilarious way that they keep snitching on themselves so consistently? So it's just idiotic in that way. And two, we were talking when we covered this on This Week in Guns, we said this this statute should actually be called the 416 Barrett Act, because California banned 50 cals, and so what did Barrett do? They made a slightly smaller cartridge that's actually better, and that's 416 Barrett. So it would be the 416 Barrett Act. Everyone would just go to 416 Barrett, and it's actually slightly better, and actually slightly better at all the things that people are scared of 50 cals being able to do. So, because 50 cals actually not that good at the things that people are scared of them doing it with.
The Stop Arming Cartels Act seems to be designed to impress the uninformed in a way.
Yeah.
It's really impotent to cause any possible change. It's just for example, these cartels, they're already people who are committing very illegal acts. The fact that they're going to be deterred by these particular gun laws is, just not very likely. And frankly, it's just not going to bring about any meaningful change. I mean, this is basically people putting it forth are using self-congratulation as a basis for morality.
Yeah.
And,
they're all jelking each other.
Yes. And from here, I want to take it to my particular favorite case of gun control and the arguments surrounding it, the rebuttals to it. There are a lot of people who will cite the infamous federal assault weapons ban that was in place from 1994 to 2004 as proof that gun control works. They will often provide certain statistics from this time and present it as allegedly showing that there was less gun violence and that this was successful. For example, I do often think about the Columbine High School shooting from 1999 that was clearly not prevented by this particular ban.
No, yeah, because they just used the guns that looked funny.
Exactly. Yes.
The assault weapons ban made really ugly guns for a couple of years.
Right.
Guns got really ugly.
Yes.
That's all it was. So, and it's just like anything else with Prohibition. You set arbitrary standards and people do arbitrary things.
Right.
That's what happened.
Right.
Like a bunch of beautiful Chinese AKs were made very ugly because of the assault weapons ban.
Right.
The Norinco Mac 90, they turned it stupid.
The law specifically, it banned any manufacture, any transfer, possession of the semi-automatic weapons, along with the large capacity feeding devices. And, all this really did was it just caused those who are manufacturing it to work around that particular ban. It didn't actually, create any meaningful change from what I'm gathering here. So in this case, to be clear, you are saying that any statistics showing that this federal assault weapons ban, was successful, is misleading in some way. You believe that it's misreporting the statistics?
The official answer was that when they analyzed it post sunset was that there's no possible way we can attribute anything to the assault weapons ban. That was the GAO, right, trying to justify it, saying it would need to be in place for another 20 years. Then maybe we would know. But the thing is, all of the things that they point to that went down continue to go down for the next 20 years. It the only times we've had spikes in violent crime and stuff was, would you imagine, related to locking everyone in their homes and then only letting them out when it gets really hot, right? And then crime spike. Oh no.
I'm beginning to notice something of a common thread among the fallacies that are present in these gun control laws that are being passed, and that is that a lot of people are focusing on these false cause fallacies. If a law is being put forth, regardless of what the law is in particular, or regardless of what the effects are, whether there's a positive, trend or a negative trend, they automatically associate that trend with that law.
Right.
When in reality, there are in fact other explanations that should not be ruled out, despite the fact that these people, in their search for one particular answer, are dismissing all the other potential outcomes or explanations.
Well, and it's always a forest for the trees issue too. Right? They're always zoomed in on the whatever point they're trying to make, right? They'll show you the 1 year after the ban, and look, see, crimes went on, and you're like, zoom out, and they're like, no, right? So it's either dishonest or just hilariously poorly researched.
Another very often cited, example of gun control that's popular now is the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
Oh yeah, that was a good one.
Yes, that was put forth around 2022, and I'm curious what exactly your stance is on that.
I mean, it's just a bunch of nonsense. That just screwed over everyone aged 18 to 21. That was the most significant impact. And then after that, the second most significant issue is directing the ATF to cock up the definition of engaged in the business of. And so this is the question of, at what point are you illegally dealing firearms without a license? And the law previously said somebody who needs to have a license is somebody who it's their primary source of livelihood is selling guns. Then they changed it to primarily for pecuniary gain. What does that mean? what does that mean? How many? Like, and so that just got thrown completely to the wolves, and it basically, that was a gift to state prosecutors, or you know, Fed prosecutors who want to tack something on. You sold a gun, you made a profit, right? It's just like, it created a vague knock-on offense that'll just be used to tie people up and force more prosecutions that should have been abandoned into a plea agreement. That's all it is, which then creates another prohibited person, which then creates another person for them to then stop and frisk and lock in jail. Because I don't know if everybody knows this, but the majority of federal prisoners are there not for doing something bad, but for having possessed a gun while being prohibited from possessing a gun.
There's something fundamentally Machiavellian about that too. This tendency to imprison people for crimes that they might commit later on, potentially, rather than actually punishing them for deeds that have already been done. But as far as that particular Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, yes, I do think that it's obviously a very silly law. And one of the regulations in particular that had me cracking up was that it did prohibit anybody from owning a firearm for 5 years if they had been convicted of violence against, and I quote, a current or recent former dating partner.
Yeah.
So apparently, violent convictions are okay if they're against people that you're not dating, or at least somebody that you didn't date recently.
So what that does, that actually does something very specific. It's the Lautenberg Amendments, right? Because it was previously only felonies, and then in the 90s we got the Lautenberg Amendments, which are not okay, because these make people who are domestic violence misdemeanors permanently disenfranchised of their rights. But so then it became common practice, because in some parts of the country it's very common for, and I'll say something controversial because I don't care, I'm a practicing attorney and I've had to deal with this. Sometimes bad meaning ex-partners will notice that they have a leverage over a person and they will use it. So the criminal justice system is aware of this, and in fact a lot of state prosecutors are aware that this is something that is abused, and so they will handle it in different ways. They will specify the crime as not being right, like they'll make it non-domestic, recategorize it in some way, and then what this law does is it still catches those that were engaged in that practice, but for a specific period of time rather than permanently. And it's targeted at, right, because this was sold to the lawmakers as this grand loophole, when no, in reality, this was prosecutors having to work on their feet not to do a grave injustice against people who there really wasn't that good of a case against, and they're trying to get a plea agreement because it's not a good case, and they just want to do some community service or whatever and get it behind them and never talk to this other person again. This was sold to the lawmakers as they're getting around it, and then they're going to go right after they get done with community service and they're going to go and kill their romantic partner, and that's not what happens, but they got to sell it as that you've prevented this thing somehow.
To kind of change gears here and move towards more of almost a historical examination, we've had federal regulations of guns since, I believe, 1934. The government has been increasing.
They tried to once before that, and it was a hilarious failure.
Right, yes. But since 1934, they've successfully been increasing the scale of its regulations of firearms to include, minimum wage, the country where the firearm was produced, heavier taxes on certain firearms, restricting and outright prohibiting certain firearms from certain groups of people. So I'm kind of curious, just overall then, having addressed all of this, what regulations do you think should ideally be in place, and why do you think that this regulation has increased so much over the past 90 or so years?
So fear and scapegoatism, right? So why did we get the NFA, right? And so there's the Toyota management philosophy is to find the source of a problem, ask why 5 times, right? So why did we get the NFA? St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Why did the St. Valentine's Day Massacre happen? Well, there was some mobsters who had taken control of a city, and it was being challenged, and so there was, wait, hold on. Why did the mobsters have so much control? Well, they were engaged in alcohol. They were selling alcohol, and they gained a lot of power doing this. Why were they able to gain so much power selling alcohol? Well, we made it so that only they could do it. Well, and why do we do that, right? And so then, so you get all the way to the beginning, right, of that, and it's because we needed a scapegoat for the problem that we had created through Prohibition. Just like in the 80s and 90s, we needed a scapegoat for the problem that we created through drug prohibition, right? It's always about gang violence, and what's gang violence is turf wars. Well, what's turf wars? Well, it's sales territories. For what? And for the thing that you made it illegal to just sell online and let everybody just like enjoy their part of the market. So it's like, all that to say, Prohibition is the source of all gun control. It's the reason that we were able to bottle it up and sell it the way we did. Ideally, what regulations should be in place? I don't think that there needs to be any specific laws. I think that English common law and the tort system handle everything that would need to be in place. So like, I think that common law would, create a mechanism to recover from companies that sold faulty guns, as they did at the founding era, right? There were companies that sold some bad guns and they got in trouble. And I think that is fine. Aside from that, I mean, people who are, I think if you're dangerous enough to be disarmed, you should probably be incarcerated. So have like a, reasonable standard of who you incarcerate. And I don't, and maybe just those things that were felonies at the common law, like arson, like real crimes. And I think that if you have to lock them in the box, you keep them in the box until they can be a good boy. And if they can be a good boy, they can come out of the box and have their gun. Because at the founding era, like, it wasn't like we had widespread, horrifying violence or all this stuff. In fact, oftentimes they would keep your property locked up, at the front and hand it to you. And there were stories of people who would take their carbine and go into the woods to go and, do their little life, kill a squirrel or whatever, So I don't think I guess, suffice to say, I think the common law provides everything that would need to be common law, both in civil and criminal context, right? Because murder, common law, felony, right? It handles everything that needs to be handled with firearms.
The solution does not lie so much in passing regulations of who was allowed to own firearms, arbitrarily or anything like that.
Right.
And furthermore, like you were saying, as far as prohibition being one of the driving forces behind, gun control and things such as that, what I'm finding is that almost seems to mirror a lot of what still goes on to this day under gun control legislation, where passing these laws end up preventing the most responsible members of society from essentially using them, or like one could in the case of selling alcohol in those days, and instead, shifts that to the most, criminal, people to actually run forth without any with considerably less opposition, really.
Right. Well, so it's like, Prohibition is such a wonderful example because it's so directly on point, right? But in nowadays, what's the most popular alcohol, right?
Right.
Beer and wine.
Yes. Yeah.
Before Prohibition, what was the most popular alcohol? Beer and wine.
Yep.
During Prohibition, bathtub gin.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Right? You've only made it worse. So it's, but people can't accept that sometimes the answer is to just not touch it. Right. And just unfortunately in the gun context, the immediate and visceral reaction to people taking matters into their own hands and like making their own guns or whatever, which is very important and frankly one of the coolest, most badass things an individual can do is to like reflexively lock them in a cage, which I think is it's just never made too much sense to me.
And since we've seen this gun control passed, and as it's increased, we've seen also many more government agencies rise up. We've seen the CIA, and my one that I personally really like to speak on is the ATF. So I don't I want to emphasize here that I don't mean any sort of comical exaggeration when I ask you, why is it exactly that the ATF in particular is evil?
So the problem is, like, going all the way back to the genesis of the ATF as an organization. It was to serve the purposes that the Department of Treasury said, we will not do this because it violates people's rights. Like that's how the ATF started. It was because the freaking IRS agents were like, I'm not doing that to people. And like these ATF relates to, and it's like everything relates back to Prohibition, because the genesis of militarized law enforcement in this country is from the Prohibition era, when you had these World War I veterans who were like, hey, this is how you got to do it if you want to get home safe. Like the whole get home safe thing starts with Prohibition enforcement. And like I don't remember the articles because I never remember anyone's name, but like there's all these parallels that were drawn, and they found this guy who was a cop trainer, right, who was like the start of all of this getting people shot business. And it was the ATF, well, not the ATF, right, but it was the Treasury agents who would go and enforce the federal prohibition laws. And they'd go out into the backwoods of nowhere where they were doing these brews, and they would be very violent. And then if you're a person who is engaged in brewing or whatever it is, right, and you know that, hey, they're sending some like very violent motherfuckers, is your response going to be to like wear a teddy bear or whatever? Like, you know, I'm sure some people got pushed out of the business, but the ones that didn't were probably like, right, like we're going to conceal and defend. And that's what happened. And then it was just a spring back and forth, increase in hostility and violence on both sides of it, started by the government. Like, and one of my favorite stories is like just how like different we are as a nation now. Like, David Marshall Williams, who's responsible for the floating tappet system that was used in the M1 carbine, was in jail for shooting a revenue agent in the face because he was moonshining, and he shot this cop in the face. And in jail, he designed a floating tappet system that would be very useful in the war effort, and so they made him a national hero in community defense. I don't think that would happen anymore. I think it would be like you're designing gun parts in the jail machine shop. You like put him in solitary forever. But that's like, you know, closer to when that stuff happened, this mind poison hadn't fully taken on. And so people were like easier able to see the objective utility in a self-loading firearm, being able to run cleaner and more efficiently. And so they were like, cool, right? Get this guy out of jail.
I often say, you know, where the rights of man ends, the ATF begins. You know, it almost seems a way to get around man's personal liberties.
And there's a lot of problems with ATF. Like, ATF is an agency that has, and, you know, I've met ATF agents that were very cool people many, many times. And I've met, like, I'd say probably 50% of the agents at ATF would not engage in horrors if they were, like, you know, directed to do them. But that's not enough, right? Like, the problem is they often don't have a director. And so they often don't have a director, and they're an agency whose genesis was in doing the work that other agencies wouldn't. So they took the JV squad of all of the like biggest psychopaths ever and started it. And then those guys selected their replacements at the middle and high levels, right? And so then when you don't have a director with who the blame can fall on when you're doing atrocities, who cares, right? It's like no one talks about the upper middle management that's like the actual multi-generational people that are here from way back in the beginning. There's no accountability. And so that gets baked into an organizational institutional culture And so they are like, compared to, and you know, so like being a defense attorney, I have had to interact with agents at a lot of different federal agencies, and I will tell you something. And I will say I've met ATF agents that were good people that I would and have had beers with, but like compared to the amount of FBI agents and even like DHS agents that I've met that I would have beers with, it's a hugely different. Like, to be super clear, very frequently meet FBI guys that are okay. Not so much on the other side. And like people at FBI like say, I want to stay away from those guys. Like I've met FBI agents that are like, I am scared of ATF agents. More than once. So it's spooky.
The FBI and, you know, the CIA and organizations like them their problems tend to be very systemic and broad, you know, in many different areas. Whereas when I think about the ATF and their flaws, that tends to be more of a specific, concentrated area.
Yeah, and they like to behave more like a traditional law enforcement body, which is terrifying, you know, when it's federal.
Right.
So.
Yes. So at this point, you know, we have laid out and addressed a lot of the anti-gun movement fairly extensively. And I do think it would be fitting from here to examine the positive case for guns rather than the negative ones. So in making a positive argument for gun ownership, what would you tell somebody, you know, why should people own firearms? Let's say somebody was afraid, you know, of guns. They might be concerned that, what if, you know, God forbid, one of their children gets into the guns? What if there's some type of accident there? Or they're concerned that it poses more of a risk to them than any real benefit. What type of case would you make that people should own firearms now in the 21st century?
So I'm glad you phrased it like that, because I think the reason a lot of people are anti-gun is because they are uncomfortable with their intrusive thoughts. And everybody has intrusive thoughts, and we don't talk about it enough as a society, where, you know, people need to be aware that, like, yes, it's normal to have those like weird, bad thoughts, and it doesn't mean you're going to do those things. I think that most people who are anti-guns and like don't have experience with guns are scared about having a gun in their home because they're uncomfortable with their own psyche. And it might be that their psyche is actually, like, maybe it is abnormal, right? Maybe they are having abnormal thoughts. But I think that if you are a person that trusts yourself with your automobile, right? Because that's a very common intrusive thoughts when you're driving down the road. Yes. Like, I'll say, yeah, exactly. Who has not been driving down the road and didn't just think, I wonder what would happen if I just, right? Everyone thinks that. It doesn't mean you're going to do it. Having guns means that you'd have thoughts like that once in a while. And it's uncomfortable. And the fact that you feel uncomfortable about it means you're a responsible, normal person. So be okay with that, and that discomfort. But if you like really think that, like I had actually, like, there was a girl I knew who said like she had a gun, but she kept it locked up. And I was like, why? She's like, I know that if I was in a situation where I'd have to use it, I would not be able to. So I keep it locked up. And I'm like, good gun owner. Like,
right.
Actually good. You should train with it until you don't feel like that. But because I'm not a gun owner who says gun owning is for everybody, right? Like, there's some people who are just not strong of will, and people who are not strong of will probably shouldn't be projecting force over distance. That doesn't mean you can't become that way, but it's a question of whether you as an individual feel that you are mentally capable of knowing right from wrong and knowing when to use an emergency implement, period. It's like a fire extinguisher, but right? Fire extinguishers have downsides. They cause problems when you use them, especially if you use them wrong. it's kind of the same thing. It's a seatbelt. Like, when you get in your car and put your seatbelt on, is it because you're like, I'm gonna crash this fucker? Like, no. So those are the use cases I've talked about with people where it's like, okay, well, so, and we talk about, like, break-ins happen, like, these things happen. Do you feel like if that happened, like, what is valuable to you? And, like, especially if you have a family, that's probably very valuable and not replaceable. If your only concern is for things that are not very valuable and highly replaceable, and you're scared of guns, you don't need to have a gun. Right? And like, that's saying, and they're not even concerned about themselves, right? And there's some people who are like that, who are like, I don't think there's sufficient risk that somebody would come in just to target me. And I don't have anything that's worth, whatever. That's fine. But if you have a family, you've probably got something that's worth protecting. So you should probably man or woman up and get yourself to the point where you can competently use an emergency tool if you have to. I think just framing it like that, like being very clear, like, this is a tool and it's for if something bad happens, right? That's what I think the most important utilization of the firearm is. And that's, I'm somebody I'm a competitive shooter. I don't hunt because it's boring. But like, I do everything you can do with guns, except hunt because it's boring. And I really, like, I'm not going to sit here and say, whoa, but it's a sport and you're going to go blah, blah, blah. No, this is for if you have to kill somebody.
Right.
And you have to, like, be enough of an adult to deal with the fact that that's a possibility. And it might happen even to someone like you. It's that if you're not mature enough to deal with that, then you might not be mature enough to have a gun.
The best policy towards gun ownership is just really raw, unflinching honesty with yourself. Ask yourself, why should I have a gun? What are the drawbacks of it? Do the benefits outweigh the potential cons? I think
but also the people who, like, you did mention the people who are like, oh, I'm worried it might hurt me. Like, that's a really stupid statistic, right? It's like drownings are more common when there's pools. It's like, just having a gun doesn't, it, like, they're very advanced, they're not technologically advanced. They're very mature. They're very mature, simple machines, and they're very safe. And they do what you tell them to. So if you have your wits about you, your gun isn't going to go off, right? And as far as having kids around, that's been a thing forever, and there's ways to deal with that. So it's not like I have the gun, now I'm in danger, right? It's I have a gun, now gun-related things can possibly happen. That's what it is. You're still the one who is in control over the probabilities, even including, like, kids getting access. You're in control as to how likely that is. So, sorry to cut you off there.
Oh, no, not a problem. It's just that, the gun, like you're saying, the gun is not going to go off by itself, regardless of what certain...
Unless it's a P320.
Right, yeah. So unless, despite what Alec Baldwin will tell you.
Yeah.
Yes. But basically, the Second Amendment, for example, that's really undeniably, I would say, one of the most frequently referenced and cited amendments in the Constitution. It is objectively one of the most, and I would say just perhaps, arguably, possibly, from a certain perspective, the most important amendment in the Constitution. Now, I know it might seem shocking to some of the more to-the-letter constitutionalists to say that some amendments are, in fact, more important than others.
Right.
That is to say that not all amendments are equal. But the fact is that they're not. And I really do wish to emphasize here that man's rights do not come directly from the Constitution, but from a more objective, universal source. What I mean by this is, if the Second Amendment were, let's say, repealed tomorrow, that wouldn't mean that our right to legally bear arms no longer exists. It still exists. It's just that the drafters of the Constitution were correct in listing it as one of our rights, right, and today's politicians would be incorrect in delisting it all of a sudden. So anyway, what I'm asking here in short is, what is it exactly that you think, makes the Second Amendment more important than certain other amendments?
And so, like, this is hard for me because I don't consider myself a constitutionalist or constitutional scholar because I fully believe that. Well, and like look at Bastiat, like one of the things he pointed to, which is ironic, him being French, right? If only he knew it would happen in a couple decades. But he was like, obviously, you couldn't tell somebody that they don't have the right to defend themselves with a weapon. Like, obviously, because it's so core and natural to an individual's autonomy over his own form that preventing somebody from exercising control over their form flows from just the right to exist, right? So I do think that it's like philosophically so obvious, right, to have the right to use any implement in defense. That doesn't mean offense, right, in defense. But the Second Amendment is important because it says the quiet part out loud, or it's like the people need to be able to exercise force at a moment's notice against whatever. And like we're one of the only countries that said that out loud, probably because of the context in which it was written, right? These were people who had just fought a bitter, what would have been at the time, civil war against their relatives, and some mercenaries. But right, like look at the context. These were people who were like, these were our brothers. Like they share our last names. We speak the same language, right? We're going to try to make it so that doesn't happen again. And so what's one of the ways? Well, we noticed that right away they tried to take our guns. So that must be important to people who have bad ideas. So let's enshrine that you don't get to do that. And I think the fact that the government's current thing is, how do we get around this, is intensely suspicious.
Right. In fact, that actually ties into my own personal thoughts on it. I've always thought that the Second Amendment is particularly important because essentially without the right to bear arms, what other rights can really be protected? I mean, at least at the bare minimum, the private citizens have a chance at having their other rights without them just being, snatched away from them by virtue of them being able to bear arms.
Right.
In case of, some type of aggression against them.
Yeah.
But since we are approaching the end of our conversation, there is an interesting personal matter I kind of wanted to get your particular view on. So you obviously have a deep passion for and an interest in firearms. So then, do you believe that the world is a better place with firearms? That is to say, would you rather live in a world where firearms didn't exist?
So this is actually something that me and one of my best friends when I was in DC disagree on. And he posed a question: if there was a button, right, and you could press the button and the gun never happened, would you press it? And I said, hell no. And he said, hell yes. And I was like, because my thing is, I don't want to see, because I think of what was before the gun, like how did people fight before the gun? And that's horrible. Like we're talking about physically dismantling each other and also placing a huge premium on physical strength of the individual. Huge premium when we're not dealing with force over a distance. And that's not fair. So I think guns are a societal advancement because they take physical premium. Right, it's still there. It's always going to be there, but they don't make it the decider. Right, it makes skill and the popularity of your position the decider, which I think is probably a better outcome than pure physical strength.
Murder was certainly, prevalent before the invention of the gun, right. And at least the gun, if nothing else, serves as an equalizer, in effect. And I believe that just by its very existence, it makes, personal, individual autonomy easier to enforce in a way, easier to preserve without being, encroached upon by somebody bigger or stronger or more people in number being able to outweigh that one individual.
The gun makes the 80-pound girl walking home, right, able to be a credible threat to, 2 or 3 300-pound guys.
So finally, what advice would you give to someone who's ill-informed about the specifics of firearms? People similar to myself. people who are in a similar position to me, what advice would you give them if they want to change that and become firearm enthusiasts? What information should they keep in mind, and what type of equipment would you recommend for a beginner purchase?
So this is the thing that really sucks, because the worst thing for the Second Amendment is gun people. Gun people are horrible. They are incredibly exclusionary. They act like they don't want anyone to become a gun person. So, this is where people who were not as experienced with the gun crowd would say, go to a range and ask to be seen stuff, right? You're going to have to do that. You're going to have to go to a range and ask to rent something or whatever, but I'm going to warn you and say it's going to suck, most likely. It's most likely going to be a bad time. They're going to lord over you. They're going to be like yelling, and it's going to be terrible. But if you want to just have fun, and you want to, like, this is something that's interesting to you, buy a semi-automatic 22. Really doesn't matter which one. Just get something cheap. Get a 1022 or like a Rossi or whatever, and just go out to the range and start shooting at stuff. If you can find an outdoor range that like lets you, or a buddy's property is the best, just shoot at some cans and see if you like it. And if you do, go from there. You'll find pretty quickly, what gets you going, like whether you like manually operated guns or automatic ones better. If you're like, I've decided I really, need to take my personal autonomy and safety into my own hands, I'd say, congratulations. That's a big step in, I'd say, being an adult. And I'd say you need to have a full-size pistol and a carbine. And so I'd say, you need to get some full-size or compact 9mm, like a Walther PDP or a Glock 19 or whatever. Whichever of those you like the most. And also an AK of some description. You will never be mad that you have an AK. You may wind up liking the AR more, but you'll never be mad that you got it. So that's my suggestion there. It's hard to find people who are good shooting buddies because gun people are so incredibly awful, but they're out there. And as you go to the range and like start to interact and see how other people do it, it's just like any hobby, right? Treat it like a hobby, but it's a hobby that relates to something much more important.
There does seem to be something of a wide variety, not just one particular firearm that one can go for. We can go talk about the Walther PDP. We can talk about the AK that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
There are many different options one can go with. I guess at the end of the day, much like many other things in life, it does depend on that person themselves, their own individual preferences, and what they're looking to get out of the firearm. Right. Yes. Yes, exactly.
In their budget. If you have a higher budget, make sure the AK was not made here. It will be better. It doesn't matter where, as long as it wasn't made here, except for yes. But yeah, that's a thing. But but most importantly, just enjoy yourself. And also, if you're watching this and you're somebody who's into guns, be the person that proves me wrong about gun people. And look for those new novice shooters at the range and just talk to them friendly. Don't shout, it's not a clip, it's a mag or whatever. Like, don't shout at them about their finger on the trigger. Like, speak with a even voice and smile and be having a good time so that other people can have a good time. You can correct somebody on doing something unsafe without being awful, right? Or something that you perceive as unsafe. So the most important thing you can do as a gun owner to make more gun owners is to have a good time and look like you're having a good time. I think that's important.
Right, exactly. Yes. So on that note, for anybody out there who's looking to get into guns, certainly make a note to strive to be the best gun person you can be. Try to be one who's likable, try to be a good person who really takes this seriously and does their best, and it obviously remains safe and responsible with guns overall. So with that said, I want to give many thanks to you, Matt, for appearing on the show. Many thanks to the Fudd Busters channel, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye. Make sure to follow Fudd Busters in their work, subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. Everybody out there, have a good one. Bye-bye.